Finally, it is time to install this Swedish gold. Is it Swedish any longer? I don't know. It is a US owned company, I think, but still we will be installing the Öhlins Road and Track coilovers with a 10 kilogram spring on front and a 5 kilogram spring on the rears. So these come in two packages, I believe. One is with a 7 kilo on the fronts and 4 kilo on the back, or a 10 and a 4 kilo on the back. But in my case, I bought these second hand and I wanted to try Öhlins out. So we will get to why I switched from my Mazda Club Race coilovers. So for those of you who don't know, I did own a Mazda Club Race coilover setup then, but I sold that and I got my hands on these, and they had barely been used that much. So I thought, why not give it a go? We will get to why I'm switching from the Mazda Club Race ones to these later on in the video, but I just wanted to briefly give a background on why we are here where we are today. And today's video will not be similar to as per other usual videos I do with a step-by-step guide on how to do that. We have a video for that when I was installing the Mazda Club Race coilover, so I'll link that up above or in the description down below if you want to check that out. But today I would like to talk about a little bit what I felt with the Mazda Club Race coilovers, and also some tips and tricks if you do get a set of Öhlins Road and Track coilovers on how you assemble it. You can use as an example, the OEM top mounts, or you can do what I chose to do, is to go for an aftermarket one, and these are from Miata Speed or Sake Bomb, and we will discuss a little bit around that as well. And yeah, so that is the intention of today's video. And welcome, it's been a while. If you do like today's video, give it a thumbs up, and also do remember to subscribe for future content. But with that said, let's talk about what parts needs to be installed to have this ready to go onto the car. Let's briefly have a look at the damper assembly itself. So we obviously have the shock or damper, and then we have a bump stop, we have a spacer and a washer, and these then come pre-assembled from factory from Öhlins then. And we do then have a shock boot which goes on top like so. You don't have to fixate it right away now. We can just leave it loose as it is. And then we do have a smaller washer sent from Öhlins that goes on top of the shaft here. And then we have a larger washer here that goes on top of the smaller washer. Then we have our springs, and these we would then install on top of the perch like so. And then Öhlins do send out these spring adapters, and we do have a rubber spring seat here as well. And this would then go on top like so, and this is a front strut then. So that will be that, and the next step would be then to installing the top mounts, either if you have then removed the OEM top mounts or bought a set of spare parts, so to speak, you would then mount the OEM top mounts. As you can see, we do have a rather large rubber bushing here with a little bit of a tip on it. That will go in first. We do then have this metal sleeve which would go on top and in on top of the shaft. Then we would take the top hat itself, have it positioned here. It's a little bit difficult to do all this on video like so. And then we have another rubber bushing which would go on top here. And then we have this top washer then, which would go on top like so. And then we do then have a locking nut locking all of this together, and then we do have the knob for adjusting the dampening and rebound then. But we will not be installing the OEM parts as I just showed you now. We will be using an aftermarket top hat setup, which I then got from Miata Speed, and I will show you what that looks like. And it's a little bit different then because we don't have any rubber parts on those top mounts. So this is what the Miata Speed Sake Bomb top mount assembly looks like. We do have this upper spring perch or spring adapter, and this is in billet aluminum, I believe. And what is nice with this one is that it will actually center the spring or align the spring to the lower perch which we have here. And with the, if we would have been using the OEM setup, that would have not been the case, because this the spring moves around a little bit and the top perch moves around against the top hat. But that is not the case with this assembly. And what I will opt for as well is to use this rubber spring seat as well, because this is a mainly a road car, so to reduce at least some of the NVH, I will use this rubber spring seat as well. So that will go on top like so. And then, as you can see here, we don't have any rubber bushings, so these are aluminium inserts, and this would then go on from the bottom end, and this one that looks like this goes on from the top end, and then we would then mount the whole top hat assembly on top as so, and then we would lock it down with the Öhlins provided locking nuts with a mechanical locking, so this doesn't have any plastic locking, or we won't be using any Loctite, and that will go on top here like so, and this would be torqued down to 13 Newton meters as per Öhlins recommendations. And then this shaft, then it goes into the damper itself, and this can rotate if this locking nut is sitting too tight, or if you want to torque this down. What is not maybe that commonly known is that inside here, I will show you, you can put a 5mm Allen or hex key to hold the shaft in place while you're torquing this down. Before we get to those parts, obviously not having a rubber setup, which we have on the OEM top hat setup, that is obviously, the rubber is there to reduce NVH, then noise, vibration and harshness. As my car makes a lot of noises already, I felt that it would not harm me that bad, and from what I've been reading, people are not experiencing that much of a difference compared to the OEM setup. I might have well just been running with the OEM setup, but I went this route now. So that is that with regards to having rubber or not. And also having the rubber bushings, obviously there is some give to the rubber bushing first, and then that whatever dampening that needs to happen goes through the damper and springs. But not having the rubber parts, then everything is a solid mount, we could say, and the dampers and springs work as close to as they are intended with regards to their operating specifications then. So once we have installed the locking nut and torqued it down, we then have the adjuster knob for the dampening and rebound, which would then thread onto the shaft as well. Before we continue, I just want to show you how to hold the shaft in place while we are torquing down the lock nut or removing it. Could be sitting tight, and in this case we need to torque it down to 30 Newton meters, and it could be that this shaft spins, and to prevent that, what can be done is to use the adjustment knob that we have, and hopefully this comes through. As you can see, it's a hex or Allen key in itself, nothing more than that, more or less. When we thread this down onto the shaft and then turn the knob, what we essentially are doing is to actually screw that grub screw out or in, and adjusting the dampening and rebound. So what we want to do here, it is not that visible, is to tighten that grub screw down all the way to the bottom. That gives us room to actually use a 5mm hex or Allen key, because the shaft itself has a 5mm hex or Allen key, and then we can insert the Allen key into there, and we can actually hold the whole shaft in place with our ratchet wrench then while we are torquing or removing that lock nut. And to demonstrate how we would be when we are tightening this down, so we would have our lock nut like so. We would then have the Allen key on top here holding the shaft in place. We would then have our crow foot on top here, and then we would have our torque wrench done and torquing everything down. It is a little bit tricky while everything is not assembled. The damper obviously is moving around. It is doable, but it's not the most convenient way of doing it. But this is one way of then holding the whole shaft in place so it doesn't turn when you're torquing down the lock nut. Coilovers have now been installed on all four corners. If you want to know the process of removing the OEM stuff and installing a coilover, I do have a dedicated video which I will link up above or in the description box below, so you can have a look for yourself. One thing I would like to cover next is the preload then, and the preload is nothing more than a force applied on the spring before the weight of the car then actually then has any force on the spring itself. And the preload is then measured when the spring is totally unloaded, so meaning if you have the spring loose, let's say it measures 200 millimeters in length, and then the manufacturer recommends you to have 2.5 millimeters of preload. That means the spring needs to be compressed 2.5 millimeters in a state where there is no load on the spring. And for that we have the lower perch, and we do have this locking ring. So the lower perch, when we turn it, at least on these coilovers, when we turn the perch with the provided tools clockwise, we will then be threading the perch upwards, meaning we are assessing more force onto the spring. And then we will measure from the top of the spring to the lower part of the spring, and when we get the 2.5 millimeters, we know we have the recommended setting for the preload. And to lock it in place, we would then turn the locking ring clockwise and the lower perch here counterclockwise with the provided tools then to secure everything in place. So that is what is the preload and why we would like to have the preload. And it's important not to have too little preload, because then the spring can come loose when you have let's say when your tire or one side of the car fully lifts from the ground, and if you do not have enough preload, then the spring can come loose and unseat, and we can have a different type of other issues. And also the preload itself will force the damper or force the wheel then back onto the ground once it lifts from the ground then. So that is preload in very short terms. Next we will talk about how to adjust the ride height. To adjust the ride height of the coilovers, in this case on my Öhlins, then once we have tightened down the lower locking ring on the perch here and the perch itself, we can actually utilize these two rings then to adjust the ride height. But that we can only do once we have loosened up the lower locking ring, which we have here. Once that is loose, when these two rings are then tight, you don't want to mess around with it and do it incorrectly, because then you would then potentially adjust your preload, which you don't want to do. So to raise the car up, we turn the locking ring here clockwise, and to lower the car we would then turn the lower perch counterclockwise. If we turn the lower perch here clockwise, then we are obviously loosening it up from the locking we have, and then we are then adjusting the preload, which we don't want to do. So to raise the car, we use the lower locking ring here and turn it clockwise. To lower the car, we will use the perch and turn it counterclockwise, and then we are then turning the whole shock body down or up. Once we are done, we will then lock it with the lower locking ring we have here, but it is a little bit cumbersome to actually know exactly what is the right height you want to have. The manufacturers usually do then have a recommendation from the locking ring from the perch down to the lower locking ring. It should, let's say, be 95 millimeters, then it will give you X amount of ride height. But that is not always the true, because they also state that a full revolution then potentially gives you, I'm just making it up, 2 millimeters of ride height adjustment, but that's not always the case. So you need to fiddle around with this, and it's a bit cumbersome because most of the time you need to remove the wheels and then get the car, or you need to get the car up, remove the wheels, and then experiment with what setting is with regards to what you want to have. And in my case, I do have a little bit of rake, so meaning the rear end is sitting a little bit higher than the front. So I'm running 13.25 inches from the fender to the center of the hub on the rears and 13 inches on the front. And that is a general recommended setting for the ND2 MX5 then. Depending on the car, that could be different, or you should not run any rake at all. Once you have found the ride height you would want to have, and I usually then, as I mentioned, measure from the fender here to the center of the wheel, obviously when the car is back on the ground, it is to do something that is called re-indexing or clocking the bushings. You might have not heard of that, but it is actually quite important. Let's take as an example, in the upper control arm here we have rubber bushings here. I don't know if it comes through in the video, but what happens is when we lower the car from the OEM manufacturer ride height is that we are inducing a twist and binding in those rubber bushings. We have it on several places in the suspension geometry, both front and back, and in the back on the MX5 we have a bunch of them because we have a multi-link setup. So what is important is to raise, if you don't have a 4-post lift, which I don't have either, is what I do is to set a jack under the knuckle here, raise the suspension until more or less the car lifts from the jack stands, or in my case the quick jack, and we do that while we have loosened all those bolts which goes through where we have rubber bushings. Once we have jacked it up to the right height that the car will be sitting in first, then we will then torque down all those nuts and bolts to the specified torque settings, and that will give us two things. One is we will not have premature failures on the rubber bushings, and also we will prevent that something is binding and potentially you could have a car which is sitting a little bit higher in one corner than the other, and the suspension geometry is not working as intended. So that is an important step to do, even if you do just lowering springs. If you do coilovers, which you can adjust the ride height, it is important then to clock the bushings or re-index them. Before we wrap the video up, I just wanted to talk about why I opted to go for the Öhlins Road and Track over my Mazda Club Race coilovers, which I had. And as I mentioned briefly in the video, is that I got these used, so they had done around 4,000 kilometers, so I got a pretty good price, and there is no good reasoning as such on why I opted to switch. I first of all wanted to see what all the fuss is about with the Öhlins then, and hopefully we will not regret that choice. But considering then I got the top hats, which got very expensive then to get shipped here to Sweden with customs and so on, I am not sure if the overall cost is worth it. I'm at least more than double than what I paid for my Mazda Club Race coilovers, which I got then new, because those do have top hats in the kit, so to speak, and also you can have the extension arm for the adjustments in the rear for like, I don't know, $30-40, while the ones for the Öhlins are around $200. So that is that. But the main reason then why I opted to go for the Öhlins are how they manage the faster dampening and how the rebound is happening compared to the Mazda Club Race coilovers, because that is the part where I felt that those were not coping, so to speak, specifically when we had harsh roads, or you were taking a turn where the road goes a little bit like this. They didn't, how should I say, react well enough or in time to actually give the dynamics what I would like to have them. So hopefully with the dampening technique we have in the Öhlins, we will see some more sophistication with regards to that area. But apart from that, I don't think there will be any difference as such. We do almost have the same spring rates front and rear which I have on the Club Race. So we have 10
kg on the front and 5 kg on the rears. So I have a different set of springs on the rear, which I mentioned, I think I mentioned earlier as well. And the club rates were 10 and 6. So that will be very interesting to see if there will be any difference with regards to that type of dampening and rebound then compared to the club race. That I will have to do once we have the new wheels on and we have done an alignment and I've been able to do some driving. We will take the car hopefully at least once to the track this year with this setup, and also then obviously street driving. Once that is done, we will then tackle and install aftermarket sway bars. So I have JBR sway bar for the front and the hard race one ready to go. So hopefully we will see some improvement. If not, it will be an experience in itself. We will see, so stay tuned for that. And also, if you did like today's video, give it a thumbs up. And also, if you do like the channel, do remember to subscribe for upcoming review of these, then installation for the sway bars and other modifications, car detailing, etc. But with that said, I'll be seeing you on the next one.